Uralsk Turn. Immediately after traveling to Uralsk, Pushkin had his Boldin Autumn, Tolstoy Yasnaya Polyana, which was also a fruitful period. He devoted almost 10 years to writing a book which would become an immortal classic. In 1869, the novel War and Peace was finished. A random visit resulted in non-random consequences. Leo Tolstoy came to our land for kumis treatment. In 1862, he came to Uralsk to visit his friend that he knew from the Crimean campaign, Stolypin, the father of the future reformer. Count Tolstoy is a mirror of Asian liberty. Not that Leo Nikolayevich dedicated most of his literary legacy to the steppes or to Asia. However, Asia did leave a trace in the works of the classical writer. Chapter 1. As it happened. Why did it happen this way and not another? Because it did. Providence created circumstance, a genius took advantage of it, says the story. But what is providence? What is genius? Kumis was a fashionable drink in the middle of the 19th century. An object of modern medical research, it was developed and served to the patrons of St. Petersburg salons. On the 12th of May, 1862, Count Tolstoy set out on a journey from his estate Yasnaya Polyana. He was accompanied by a servant and 2 peasant boys. He fell ill. He had lung problems. He wrote in confessions that he had gotten ill and spiritually rather than physically, so he dropped everything and went to the steppe to breathe fresh air, drink kumis and live a more natural life. Perhaps the word that best describes his state of mind is disappointed. He lost interest in the new pedagogy methods that he had been so fond of, lost faith in the ideals of the time. The abolition of serfdom did not abolish slavery in Russia, and he was struggling to find other goals and ideals. He suffered another disappointment in love. He wasn't writing anything new. But every cloud has a silver lining, says the proverb Leo Nikolayevich strongly believed in. While being treated, he accidentally learned an interesting fact. The Uralsk chieftain was Stolypin, his friend. They fought together in the Caucasus. Both were captains of artillery, and he was very happy to reconnect. He didn't plan to go to Uralsk, but decided to visit his friend. A friend and a brother-in-arms, Count Tolstoy learned that his military friend was a chieftain not far from where he was staying, and of course he couldn't help but come. He stayed here for 3 or 4 days, but unfortunately little is known of his visit. It is known that in late July 1862 he was staying in the chieftain's house. The house and the writer. It is impossible to say exactly where Leo Nikolayevich was met, what they talked about, what they were doing, and how long Tolstoy was visiting his longtime friend. There was a sofa, a living room, a hall with awnings, a flower room, and Leo Nikolayevich walked around here.
И Лев Николаевич наверняка прогуливался вот по этой зале.
Unfortunately, the entire archive, rumored to have contained minute-by-minute report of the writer's stay, was lost during the Civil War. He visited the summer house. We also know that Leo Nikolayevich visited the Cossack home. He met with the youth of the Akutin club, whose members were young officers fond of art and painting. He met not only with chieftains and Cossacks, but also our boisterous Ural Cossacks who weren't intimidated by his fame in the slightest. An old man stopped him once. "Are you the Tolstoy?" "Yes, I need to speak with you." Leo Nikolayevich was surprised by the old bearded man's request. The latter brought him home, left the horse, and they stayed up all night talking about life and singing songs with other elders. It can be assumed that in the distant Uralsk, Leo Tolstoy stayed true to his habits. Usually the writer would get up early, throw on a robe and go out to greet the dawn. Before breakfast he drank kumis, ate beshparmak and in accordance with local custom, he ate the meat with his hands. That was before he became a vegetarian. We had Stolypin Boulevard in Uralsk, and in 1860 a rotunda was built, where young people gathered in the evenings to dance and listen to the brass orchestra. Leo Nikolayevich attended these events. It is known that Leo Nikolayevich did not favor balls, considering himself a lousy dancer. He was known to be a connoisseur of feminine beauty, but never had much success with the ladies. However, he did attract a certain level of attention, being a count, a retired lieutenant and a writer. He made an impression on the local elite. Having spent a few days in Uralsk, he went into the steppe.
I
live in a tent. I found a friend, Stolypin, who is now chieftain in Uralsk. I went to visit him and brought back a scribe, but I dictate and write little. All the works in which Leo Tolstoy mentions Uralsk were written much later. Chapter 2. Why? Leo Tolstoy was after literary material. He intended to write a novel about the life in the Urals. All these speculations may have a real basis. However, they are not supported by any actual evidence. Only 46 years after Ural holidays, when the writer was 80, he wrote a book called Why? Migursky's life in Uralsk, which had been dragging on for 7 months, was not only monotonous, dull and boring, it was also hard. With the exception of the battalion commander, whom he tried to avoid at all costs, he only had one acquaintance, an exiled Pole, who was a poorly educated, pushy and obnoxious man engaged in local fish trade. However, what burdened Migursky the most was his inability to get used to poverty. The story of an unsuccessful escape attempt, a short novel only 24 pages long, but in order to write it, Tolstoy had to complete extensive research. When I write something historical, I love to stay true to reality down to the smallest details, said Leo Nikolayevich. His trip, undertaken in the distant past, also helped to achieve historical accuracy. After the Polish uprising in Uralsk, there were many exiles, who Leo Nikolayevich knew personally. The story is based on real-life events. Some of the materials are still being stored in the archives. The names of the main characters had not been changed. Life in the city itself are described sparingly, but the emotional atmosphere of the providence, the hopelessness are conveyed masterfully. The exiled Migursky and his wife Albina decided to run. The husband pretended to have drowned. In reality, he was hiding in the house for a month while she wrote petitions to Orenburg and then St. Petersburg. Their children died, and she asked to be given their remains, made a big coffin and put her husband's bones there as well. He was discovered near Saratov and imprisoned in a hard labor camp. She went along with him. Leo Tolstoy attached great importance to this little story, judging by the fact that he rewrote it at least 15 times. The idea of suffering for truth and dying for freedom stirred his spirit and manifested in the narrative of the Ural life. With all his soul, he loved the way of justice. He was the owner of deep thoughts. These are the words of the great Kazakh poet Shakarim. He wrote a poem which reflected the subtleties of the experiences Tolstoy had after he was excommunicated from the church. Leo Tolstoy received a lot of mail from the steppe correspondents, for example, a teacher from Semipalatinsk with a request to translate into Kazakh and publish his stories. As a rule, Leo Nikolayevich had no objections, but the correspondence of Shakarim and Tolstoy had a special place in his life. I washed the mud of past ignorance off my heart, and I will stay true to my words. I'm a student of Leo Tolstoy, wrote Shakarim. Magjan Zhumabayev, Mirzak Abdulatov, and Alikhan Bukikhanov also declared themselves the disciples of the last prophet. Bukhanov has a story which tells of how one Kazakh responded to the name of Tolstoy. The elder said, perhaps he was Kazakh. In the deep wilderness, sitting in a cozy yacht of a rich Kazakh, I told the elders about young Russian writers and in particular Tolstoy. The master of the house smiled and asked his wife to get a box in which he kept his archive. He pulled out a sheet of paper and handed it to me. It turned out that all Kazakhs knew its content, and while they didn't want to offend my story with suspicion, they nevertheless expressed their view that the Russian writers were probably not Russian, especially Leo Tolstoy. Surely they must all be Muslims. How can it be any other way? Who knows, maybe they are Kazakhs, said one old man. The village where Tolstoy was so revered was also the native village of Abai, who was also a fan of the writer, writes Bukhanov. The master of the house is a classic of Kazakh literature, Shakarim and translator of Tolstoy. But all of this would come later, and back in the 1862, Leo Nikolayevich was not yet a prophet or the great guru of our time. He was returning home from the steppes. Chapter 3: To Change Life. Are you satisfied with yourself and your life? No, I hate my life, frowned Pierre. If you hate it so much, change it. And change it he did, as soon as he arrived. He finally proposed to Sonia Bess. For a long time he didn't dare. He was 34 and she was only 18, but this wasn't the reason. For a long time he couldn't bring himself to break the habit of an old bachelor, underestimating the chances and overestimating the risks. The last days of bachelor Leo Nikolayevich? Yes. When he left here in the summer of 1862 and returned to Moscow, he proposed and got married. And this is what he looked like at the time. Everything comes in time to those who wait. A quote from War and Peace. The vast Ural could have been the reason or maybe the last straw in a free-spirited but restless life of the writer. One way or another, in September 1862, almost immediately after his return, Count Tolstoy began a new phase of his life, both personal and literary. This trip, this visit, had a beneficial effect on Leo Nikolayevich, who had been struggling with a literary crisis. After all, he began writing Cossacks in the Caucasus, a book about the Terek Cossacks, but then stalled the work for 9 years and couldn't resume. It was only after his visit here that he arrived at fresh ideas and finished his remarkable novel. The sunrises and sunsets are almost red in the steppe. When it is windy, the wind carries heaps of sand. When it's quiet, as it was in the morning, the silence is uninterrupted by any movement or sound, which is particularly striking. This morning it was quiet and cloudy, the desert, despite the fact that the sun had risen. The area was deserted and seemed particularly soft. The air was still, and the only sound you could hear was the horses waking and huffing. But this sound was weak as well and seemed to freeze immediately. He was married and happy, at least for the time being. He also started writing a novel that he had been unable to approach for several years. Something always got in the way. What started out as a story of the Decembrists eventually became a novel about war and peace. Tolstoy had a great understanding of war and its circumstances. He knew they could destroy all things artistic in a human being and cripple his identity. To him, the world was meant to be about liberty and freedom. In this novel, he intended to express all his thoughts about perfection and imperfection, of the world, of people, and of their combination. Great transformation of the world and invisible reconstruction of the human soul, which might be less visible but is no less momentous. And who can determine the role of unremarkable Uralsk and the great Asian steppes in all this? They may have had nothing to do with it, but it is also possible that without them this epic work would never have been written.